So welcome, guys. It's a pleasure to be moderating this event tonight. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you a Rhode Island School of Design graduate who has worked with such heavy-hitting companies as Apple, Google currently, Airbnb. Before I introduce her officially, I just wanted to let you guys know that anything we talk about tonight are her opinions and not the opinions of her current or former employers. So that being said, please give a warm Miami welcome to Angela Guzman.
I hope you guys can hear me, but thank you so much for having me over. I'm actually from the area, so this is a really special venue to be part of, and thank you, Maria, for organizing this and inviting me over. It's going to be a lot of fun, I hope. And awesome to get to know you as well.
Indeed, it's been my pleasure. So we've been talking for a little over a week now preparing for this, and there's so many questions that I want to ask, but we've narrowed it down to a nice list tonight for you guys, so hopefully it'll be entertaining. So we're going to start off with welcome home.
Oh, thank you. Hola,
Right?
Miami.
So what have you missed most about Miami?
Oh, man. There's too many things. I would say that one of them is, yes, definitely croquetas and, every type of food dish that I don't find in California. It's actually, California offers a lot of meal options, but they don't have a lot of choice when it comes to Latin American food. And so when I'm here, I think the first thing I do, my sisters bring me 4 croquetas and things with arequipe and dulce de leche and all these other things. So I just devour them, and then I'm like, okay, I'm done. So food is one of them, and of course my family, most of them still live in the area, and friends and other people that I know from here.
All right, so when you're out there and you're hungry and you're thinking of home, what's the #1 pastelito pastry? What's the food you miss most when you think about here?
I would say things with arequipe. I mean, I understand that I can find similar products in California, but buñuelos, anything that's from Colombia that I grew up eating, so it's hard to find that in California. I really think of that here. But croquetas also, and things with guava paste.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So did you grow up down here?
Yeah, so I was actually born in Colombia, but I moved as a small kid to Key Largo. I don't know if you guys have gone that far south, probably. But I went to middle school and high school here in Miami at Palmer Trinity School. So I spent half of my grown-up years in the area and also in Key Largo, driving and commuting between both worlds.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. So when did you know that you wanted to be a designer? Were you a kid and you knew this is what you wanted to do with your life?
Yes. Yeah, I would say a firm yes. I think it started when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but my sister was going to architecture school. We have quite a bit of an age difference, and so I got to see her doing her products and her projects, I should say. So I would sit in her room and sort of watch from afar how she would make these models, the blueprints, all of these things that she would never let me touch in the process of making until she showed them to her class, and then she passed the grade, and then she would give them to me. So as a 5-year-old girl, I had the best Barbie houses you could imagine. And so I remember watching her assembling things, cutting little trees, little people, making spaces become a reality. And since then, she would sit with me and draw with me and teach me about perspective and all of these things that designers get to do. And so growing up throughout middle school, high school, I wanted to be an architect just like her. And right when I got into high school, towards the end, my art teacher said, hey, do you really want to be an architect? Do you know what else you can do? And I was like, actually, I don't know what other options there are for people interested in this industry or in this field. And so she left a bunch of pamphlets in my classroom for art schools. And within that space, I started to flip pages, and I came across graphic design, illustration, film and animation, industrial design. And when I came to industrial design, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like miniature architecture. This is it. And so I picked that, degree when I got into RISD, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. But yeah, that's how my transition into that design space came to be.
That is awesome. So with so many avenues open to designers, how did you decide on tech as the space for you?
Yeah, so that one was a little bit, I wouldn't say luck or chance, but it was many different ingredients came and they mixed in my life, I guess. And that was, once I was at RISD, I met a lot of engineers at Brown University. We share a lot of streets. They're literally right next to one another. And so I met civil engineers, CS majors, people in PhD programs, And I just kept hearing about their internships, the companies they wanted to work for, companies they had worked for. And of course, Google and Apple and all of those big names would come into conversation. And so at some point, I think Google, Apple, and all of them came for recruitment process in that area. And I missed Google because I had a class. But I had an opening for Apple, so I went over and I met with that recruiting team. And I remember sitting in the back of the room on purpose and telling myself, I'm not going to go up to them until everyone leaves, until everyone's done talking to them, because I just want to give them my resume and stuff and move on and don't make a big deal about it. But to your question about how I got into tech, it was really through my friends and that network of people that just kept pushing me and saying, Angela, you have to go and try this. There's this whole world out there that I don't know if you're really aware of. And I really thank them for that. I think that's how I got my foot in the door, basically.
All right. So as I mentioned in your intro, you are a 7-year art school veteran, graduated from RISD, which is the Rhode Island School of Design. And I imagine some of the designers in the audience are familiar with the difficulty of graduating something so strenuous as RISD. But talk to us about the RISD sleep schedule.
Yeah, I call it the RISD sleep schedule, I guess. So I'm sure this is common in most art schools because of the amounts of homework you get and the projects and the time it takes to make something. So when I went to RISD, you had classes that lasted 8 hours in some cases, 3 times a week, different courses, and so you had homework on top of that. So pulling all-nighters, although I don't recommend them anymore, were pretty common. And my sleep schedule sort of was non-existent. It was like you sleep whenever you can. You nap a lot if you can. And I would stay up pretty late, sometimes not sleep a whole lot, to get my homework done and to take my test the next day if I had an art history class or something. But I don't do that anymore, so I'm not saying you should take that habit. But yeah, it was that's the schedule that we had.
All right, so without condoning all-nighters, down here in Miami, we're starting to gain a little notoriety for our hackathons. We have Bitcoin hackathons, civic hackathons. So without condoning the practice, can you give some of our hackathoners a tip to pull a successful all-nighter?
Sure, mine I think is a little unique. I don't drink coffee. I'm like the only Colombian probably that doesn't drink coffee.
Blasphemy.
I know. And so what I ended up discovering is if I drink really cold water, even at like 2 a.m., it just gives me like a brain freeze that wakes me up. And so I would say take up that habit if you want and try it out. If that doesn't work, take a walk outside, open the window, stick your head out. Because like the worst thing for me to do is to sit at my computer when I'm really tired. I'll just literally pass out on the keyboard. And so I'm like, no, I can't do that. I want to make sure I know what I'm doing. And so, yeah, little breaks like that help.
All right, hackathoners, you heard it here. So I want to go back to a point you touched on before. So Apple and Google and all these companies came to RISD looking for people to come. You were in the back of the room waiting for everyone to finish. How did you land an internship at Apple?
Yeah, so when I was sitting in the back, I just remember seeing all kinds of people walk up to them and ask questions, and I was like, oh, give them their space and let them have their conversation. But at the end, I was pretty prepared. I had my resume, I had my portfolio site up, and so I went to the recruiter and I said, hi, I'm Angela. I don't know if you're looking for a designer, but here's my stuff. Let me know if you have a position for me. But take your time. And so I left, and that was pretty much the extent of my conversation with the recruiter. And I forget exactly how many days passed, but at some point he called, and he's like, oh, we were really interested in talking to you. Would you like to move to the next round for a phone interview? And of course, I was like, it's Apple. Yes, please. And when the moments leading up to that phone call, I was terrified. I was like, what if I don't answer the questions correctly? What am I going to talk about? I've never had a job in tech. Like, what are they going to ask? And so I told myself, just be honest about the experience I've had. I was actually quite involved in exhibit design previously as a college grad. And so I spoke about that and how you design spaces and guide visitors through this open space, which is very similar to UI design if you think about it, when navigation patterns take into place and your intuition sort of kicks in. And so I spoke with them on the phone, and I thought I bombed it. I was like, oh, God, I don't know how I answered those questions. But then, like, I think the same day he called and he's like, I don't know what you told them, but they really liked you, so would you like to come to California? And, of course, I said yes again. But, yeah, that's how I got started.
That is awesome. So I recall reading that in 2008, the first project you were given at Apple was to design the very first set of emojis for the world. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, that was a really interesting time. I think as an intern, it didn't really click in me that that project would, 10 years later, would still be so relevant and growing in the impact it's having in society. And to be honest, I had never lived in California. I had visited San Francisco years prior, but I was just in awe of everything there, like arriving there, settling into my apartment with roommates I had not met, going up to San Francisco on the weekends, seeing Steve Jobs sort of walking around in the cafeteria, in the hallway, and you're like, oh, I've seen you on TV, but now you're like literally right there. Meeting a bunch of engineers that were super smart, but I think the team that I worked on was also really, really talented, and they were incredibly warm and welcoming of me. So I learned a lot from people that were in the industry for 15 years, and I thought that was a phenomenal experience. And so to answer your question about working on the emoji, I feel like at that moment, I didn't think of it like this is an amazing project. It was like, look at everything else that's going on, and I just couldn't stop looking at all the details, and working on that project was kind of the cherry on top, where it was just awesome. And I made a friendship with my colleague Raymond, who mentored me through that assignment. He and I worked on them together. And so that mentorship led to a friendship, which we're still to this day very, very close, and just a really phenomenal time. Mm-hmm.
So is there a favorite emoji that you have of the ones you designed?
I mean, yes, I do. I have a couple, and they're for different reasons. I would say like the party popper, which is like that cone with a little confetti that comes out of it, because it's really festive. Like you guys probably have used it, and it's just very celebratory. So when I look at it, I'm like, oh, that's a fun emoji. So that stands out. And then other ones that are not so obvious and probably a little more mundane are the ones that have a lot of detail with text and numbers and typography, because even though 10 years ago when we were designing them, they were really compressed because of the pixel density on the screens, that you couldn't read what was on them. But we actually took the time to write, on the little gas pump, the amount of gallons that it had, or on the little clip thing that directors use, there's text on there that's real. So all that detail that went into them, I remember them. That's kind of something that I find very special. And so those are the ones that kind of jump out as well.
Those are awesome little details. Like I don't know about the rest of the audience, but the little details that you find like that throughout iOS and Apple, like that's one of the reasons that I'm so loyal. It's those little things that go into them. Mm-hmm. So, oh, my mind just went blank.
That's okay.
Well, so earlier this year, you wrote a piece for Medium mm-hmm. where you sort of went into the process about discussing this and sharing with the world. What was the motivation behind writing that piece?
Yeah, so in case you guys haven't read this article, I wrote on Medium back in January, and that was my first time ever publishing something in written form. And it was kind of I decided to do this for two reasons. One pretty obvious, which was to celebrate a big milestone in the existence of these emoji. 10 years ago, they launched, and we're still using them. So that was cool to sort of look back and reflect on that process. But the second reason, which is really personal and the one that really drove this project, was to highlight this relationship that I built with Raymond as a mentor and a friend. Because I think that was very, very unique as an intern to have had that opportunity. And what I think we often forget, maybe, I don't know about here, but at least in Silicon Valley, is you forget sometimes to have fun when you're working. And so having that ability to balance your life with work and having work equal fun and fun equal work was very magical. And I wanted to touch on that and remind myself of that, in fact, like, hey, these opportunities do come across, and you should just take them and be a mentor if you can, and also learn from other people. So that was the big driving force.
All right.
And it's also
Yes, so sorry, he lived in Broward County for high school, and so when we were in our internship, we had all kinds of stories about Pollo Tropical and finding plantains and driving around on 95, and it's just such a funny coincidence that, thousands of miles away, we got paired together.
Down here in Miami, you're not designing unless you've made a pollo run randomly throughout the day.
Yeah.
All right. So now that you're a design lead at Google, talk to me about your process. What's your process like?
Yeah, I would say that it's not particular to Google. It probably has started since college. It's matured and evolved and somewhat adapted depending on the scenario that I'm in. But I would answer that question kind of at a really high level, which is I like to start with a really clean canvas. And what I mean by that is, independent of what the assignment is or the project, I don't like to look at things for inspiration at the beginning. I think that, for me at least, it really limits the possibilities too soon in the process. So I really think about, okay, what is this technology trying to do? How are users going to benefit from this? What can I do to facilitate that process of learning and encountering the product as a user for the first time? And after a while, I start to create, the workflow, the architecture, how people go in and out of the app, what do I expect them to learn out of it. And at that point, when I have that UX flow, what I call the UX flow kind of figured out, I start looking at, the visual language, the color palettes, the iconography, the visual system, the typography. And at that point, that's when I start to look at inspiration. But for me, inspiration comes in many forms. It could even be a conversation I've had with a friend or walking alone with my dog and seeing something. So I draw inspiration from everything around me, and then I piece those things together. And of course, in all of this, I have colleagues also collaborating with me and giving me their feedback. That's really important. You don't want to be working in a vacuum, assuming that everything you're doing is awesome, because that never happens. And so that integration of feedback is also really key. And at that point, I think at the end, you sort of have something pretty mature and robust, and that's kind of the general process that I have.
All right. So as designers, I'd like to think of ourselves as a silent salesman. Sort of you want to let the quality and the clarity of your work speak for itself. So I want to know, when it comes time for you to present your work to your stakeholders, is there anything in particular that you do to help ensure that you get the sale, get that buy-in, so to speak?
Yeah, I sort of did this in college too. I just never realized it until I got into a more professional setting, which is practice. Like, I cannot emphasize that enough. If you're really good at understanding the thing you're presenting because you worked on it and it makes sense to you, that's great. But then you have to learn how to explain that to the audience, independent of who that is. It could be your colleague, it could be your boss's boss, the SVP of a company. It doesn't matter. They have to be able to understand what you've done. And so storytelling, but it doesn't mean sugarcoating the truth, right? The work should almost speak for itself. You're just there to facilitate how you go from this stage to this stage to this stage in the transitions and stuff. And so what I do with stakeholder scenarios, I practice quite a bit in advance. Some other people I know don't do that and it still goes fine, but for me, I like to prepare possible questions they may ask, things that I also haven't quite figured out because maybe I don't really know the technology in detail, so I can't possibly answer those questions. So bringing your partners in engineering or product are really key, and making sure they know your limitations and the knowledge you may have, so then you can say, hey, actually, that's your question, what do you think? So just being really honest with the audience and having that story process.
Excellent. All right, so I don't want to know what was said in the room. I don't want to know what transpired. I just want to know, on a scale from 1 to 10, how good does it feel to get a buy-in from Steve Jobs?
Pretty good. It's like a rock comes off your shoulder. No, it's good.
All right. So I'm not sure the audience knows, but you've worked on products. So not only have you done emojis for Apple, but you've worked on FaceTime. You've worked on messages for Apple. I believe you've worked on Google Play?
Google Now.
Google Now and the Assistant. So having worked on such popular and successful products, what would you say are some of the key factors in designing something that multiple millions of people are going to use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one that may get overlooked sometimes, but that's testing the implementation, because you can make an amazing design flow, beautiful animations, the latest whatever's, all the bells and whistles, and it looks great on your computer. But when the engineer takes that information and maybe they have questions because you didn't spec it very well or there's some details you missed, it's really important to work with your engineering team and test the product before it goes out into the masses. And that's kind of how I started. At Apple, that was really, really key. And so I carried that through my career, and I try really hard to build strong relationships with my engineering team or teams that I've worked with, because there's a lot of information that gets lost through red lines. And so I would sit and file bugs all the time, test the little edge cases, because thousands of people are going to see this, millions of people are going to see this, so imagine hitting that bug every time. That's really frustrating. So if I can catch more bugs, that's awesome. And so I would say that's kind of the highlight of that.
All right. What advice would you have for local designers here that want to make it in big tech?
Yeah, I would say be fearless. Don't be afraid of anything, because it's really far to go think of, oh, I'm going to California, but it's actually not that far at the end of the day. And why I say this is because everyone basically qualifies to enter Silicon Valley. I would say focus on getting your resume really clean. I can give you a few tips on that in a second, but also have your portfolio site really up to date. Speak to the work that you're most proud of, the thing that touches most of your skill set. And within your resume, for example, I was talking to some recruiters recently about, what would they love to see in a resume that makes their job easier and also more beneficial for the potential hire. And that's having your LinkedIn information on it, which I actually never thought about, but they live in LinkedIn, so make sure you have that in there. And have your name, your location. You guys probably already know all of this, but focus more on the product descriptions that you've worked on than the actual skills and software that you may use, because if you've done something, it's very obvious that you know how to use those tools. Don't ignore that, don't hide it, but just don't make it the loudest thing on the page. And then if the company you're working for is not super well known, it's important to also describe what that company does, maybe in one sentence, so that the recruiter or other folks can read about it and understand how you're tying into their product. But yeah, I think, apply. Oh, and then the other thing that I've learned is, don't give up, because stay in touch with a recruiter as much as you can. Maybe every year, if you're really interested in that job, contact them again, because they go through a lot of people, and it's important to keep them kind of, hey, I'm here. So insist a little bit, and I think that really pays off.
Those are all excellent tips. And I have to apologize ahead of time because we didn't discuss this beforehand, but I really want to know, in the past, when you've submitted resumes to companies, is there a touch of color in your resume, or is it standard issue black and white?
Pretty black and white.
Okay.
Let's see.
Good. Keep it clean and minimal.
Yeah.
I dig that. So this has been an excellent conversation. I'm not sure how much time we've gone through, but I know that I would be failing the Miami community if I didn't inject the slightest bit of controversy into this interview. So as my final question for you, I've got to know.
Okay.
For the hundreds in attendance and the millions watching at home, is it GIF with a G or GIF with a J?
I go with GIF.
Oh! The crowd is pretty evenly split. We've got a 50-50 support. All right. Thank you so much for answering all these questions.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Angela Guzman.
It's now all your turns. We want to hear from you. What are your big questions for Angela? So if you raise your hand, please wait for me to walk over with the mic so that we can get this on video.
Hey, Angela. Nice to meet you, by the way.
Hi.
I was curious to know the difference in the culture between Google and Apple, because the way I see it, it's sort of two total opposites of the spectrum.
I knew this question would come up. Yeah, they're pretty different, but they're both, in my opinion, really great places to work for. I would say neither is better or worse. I think during my career, being there at that moment was key. So I can't say that I like this one more than the other because that's just not.
How would you describe the difference, though, between the two cultures?
Yeah, so, I mean, you guys know that Apple is pretty private and they don't discuss too openly what they're working on, but I respect that tremendously from their product lineup and their roadmap, the things that they have in mind. And Google is very open and very good about being like that. And so seeing the two worlds and having companies that are very successful based on those principles is really interesting because it means it's like a very diverse space and they really, like it doesn't really matter at the end of the day how the culture works as long as it works, right? Because both Apple and Google are very successful companies. So I don't know if that sort of answer your question about the culture.
It almost seems like one is more on the fear side, the other one is like lay on a hammock.
No, I mean, from that perspective, I think they're both very chill. Yeah.
How about your time at Airbnb?
Oh, yeah, so that one was definitely on the hammock side, too. I was there for about 4 months, actually, but I did a ton of work with them. We were redesigning the whole app, and so when I arrived, I had just finished redesigning, I think it was iOS 7, so when they reskinned everything, and so I was dead tired. And when I got to Airbnb, they're like, you have to redesign the hosting space by yourself. And so I had to like ramp up about their product, what it means to be a host. I was not a host at the time, and so it was a quick ramp up. But yeah, it was really interesting to see, in my opinion, what a startup was, even though it was already pretty large, not as large as it is today, but at the time it was still pretty big. But just seeing the inner workings of, how do they operate across the board. And at Apple, I was very focused on design and touches of engineering, but here I was able to see more of the whole, everything, the marketing, the behind the scenes of every part of the company. So that was really cool. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Allie.
Hi.
So I have a question about the different stages of product design. Specifically, I'm assuming in all the companies that you've been working on stuff that's completely new from scratch. We can start white, blank canvas, and others where you have to work on something that's already existing and iterate and test from that point. So could you share some of the pros and cons that you've seen in working from scratch and evolving an existing product?
Yeah, so I'll start with the ones that are from scratch. Those can feel really overwhelming because you're like, okay, where do I start? And so I think my starting point usually is like, if I had to close my eyes, like, what would I want this thing to do? If I was a 5-year-old, or if I was someone who didn't speak English, or whatever, like, what's the easiest way to get my head wrapped around this? So you have a really big playground, basically, to do whatever you want. But I think the key in those situations is to meet with your partners, meaning like your engineering team or your product team, and understand what is actually possible with the technology, like really understand the constraints and the limitations to build something really cool. But I will say that during my career, I've never worked alone doing this. It's always been, the collaboration of a team. And so through constant feedback, you're able to sort of say, okay, I think we're still aiming for that North Star. We're not getting too far into a rabbit hole. So having that integration is really key. And then if you look at products that I've worked on, or if I look at those products that I've worked on that are existing, those can also be challenging because, putting it very bluntly, sometimes you don't want to step on people's toes because they worked on it, a year ago and they're still there. But you also have to be courageous enough to say, this doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z reasons. You have to be really good about knowing what those are. But you'll be surprised how much people are willing to take that feedback and make changes and evolve the product. And they're going to thank you a lot for doing that. So I would say continue evolving. It doesn't really matter if it's existing or not. Like, just push forward and try to make it the best you can.
Hi, Angela. I have a question about trends in UX. Are you starting to work in VR or artificial intelligence at all right now?
I can't really comment about that.
That's a yes.
He did. All over that. But I think it's a really cool technology, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Angela, maybe a little bit similar to that question that you can answer, hopefully. Could you speak a little bit about core design principles today and maybe highlight where you think that'll move in the next 5 years and how that will change over time?
Huh. I have to think about this one. He did not ask me this one. Yeah. I think, well, first of all, from what I've seen the last 10 years of being in this space, the industry has grown. There's so many more people studying it, learning about it, that I love to see that, just more diverse thinking and stuff. So from that aspect, I think it's only going to get bigger and the demand is going to keep growing. As far as like design trends, I guess it's kind of what you were going for. I don't have a crystal ball in front of me, but I think things that are perhaps maybe more customizable on the spot with like, you know, artificial intelligence and things that can sort of predict things and that are becoming smarter. I can imagine things being easier on the user, less of a issue as you ramp up or sign in or something like that.
So maybe something like an interface that's predictive or changes based on user behavior in order to best fit a specific
why not?
buyer persona?
I think so. I mean, that would be pretty cool. Like, it's more tailored to you. And I'm not saying that that is what is currently the case. These are just hypotheticals that I'm throwing out there.
The opinions are her own.
Mine. But yeah, I would say it's more tailored to an individual. That would be pretty cool.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Hi. I'm Colombian too, so I can understand the taste and deliciousness from Miami. I wanted to know more so, like, on your leisure time, what do you read as far as design, UX, anything that inspires you and really just can help other designers?
Yeah, so I will admit that I'm terrible with names of celebrities, singers, authors. So I can't like name one off the top of my head right now, but what I do like to do is I look at blogs a lot, things that are more like up to date on the now. In grad school, we did a lot of like core reading and theory, and I kind of walked away from that a little bit. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but I wanted to be more up to date on like what's happening now. So I do a lot of browsing on the internet. And I also, like I mentioned Raymond previously, he's like a phenomenal designer all around. Like, he's into interior design and all these other things. So spending time with people like that I very much look up to, he teaches me a lot not knowing it, that he's doing that. So having your network of people, I think, is also very key, influencing your design roadmap.
So is Raymond still at Apple?
Yes.
Anyone want to go work under him? Any?
Hi, I just want to know what are some of your go-to blogs that you like to go to?
Oh, see, this is me and names. I have to look at my computer because they're tabs. I know. I don't know. I look at a lot of different things. It's not just UX stuff. So I look at, as I said, Raymond does interior design kind of on the side for fun. So we exchange links to things. But I'm trying to think. Yes?
Maria, could we possibly carve out a space for some of these links in the Refresh newsletter?
Of course, we'd love that.
All right, guys, look forward to those blog links in the Refresh newsletter.
Thank you. Good idea. But great question. I need to send them over now.
For the lady who asked what to read, so I am also terrible with names, but this one I have like locked and loaded at all times. If you're a designer, everyone should really read The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman.
Hey, so I had a quick question about, when you're designing this product, you say that you work around a team, you're constantly getting feedback. And so what I'm curious about is when you do get the product in front of a user, other people, what are you looking for in that feedback? And then how do you sort of process that and implement it into your design? Like what should you take into account, what shouldn't you, and things like that?
Yeah, so working at Google, for example, we have the ability to tap into our user research team. So it's a very robust, large group of people that, that's their expertise, run tests and collect data and process statistics and all of that. And yeah, it's pretty nice to have. And so I would say that what I personally look for as a designer, not necessarily to that level of detail that they do, is this thing like approachable? Is it easy to use? Is it common sense? Are they getting hung up in certain spots that I can actually improve the experience? Because those are easy tweaks, right? Like as soon as you know the problem, as designers, we want to fix it. But finding the problem is actually the hard thing. But doing tests, and sometimes if you don't have the resources to run large tests with thousands of users, for example, I would say like just ask your like non-design friend or non-techie friend to look at it. I do that actually when I'm allowed with projects to ask family members to, hey, do you understand what this thing does? And I don't say anything. I'm just like, play with it and tell me what you think. And if they get hung up, that's crucial feedback. So yeah, like test it out with as many people as you can and just see where they get stuck. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'll go out on a limb with this
Okay.
question. I just thought of it since you work for Google, you work for Apple. I don't know if it's a question for you, but it came into my head. I want to share it with the room. The phone ecosystem in terms of design has completely stagnated. And the posture of human beings is now this, walking down the street wherever you see them. I'm proposing that the design, the evolution was wrong. And at these companies, did you see any other ideas, for instance, something that really could work in one hand, something that could handle a lot of these apps at once so you could flip through them more easily, was less complicated?
Yeah.
And maybe it's time to start over, and perhaps these companies, I would assume they have over and over. I know Microsoft tried to reinvent it with tiles. That didn't really help. But maybe you've seen something interesting. I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I can't really answer that question. I can't speak about...
Would you at least say that it's become tedious to use these things?
I don't... So I try... This is just a personal choice. I try not to spend, like, a ton of time with my tech devices. I try to be very mindful of, being outdoors, looking up rather than looking down.
I feel the same.
So I don't have that issue personally, but I can understand that some people are very heads down and they trip and fall sometimes, literally.
Get run over by a car or have other terrible accidents.
Yeah.
Maybe the Brightline train accidents, or they didn't tell you about the cell phones. Oh, you never know. Here, who's next?
I think we have time for about one or two more questions. You two.
Hi. So the question is, how do you evaluate aesthetics in Google?
How do I? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
How do you evaluate aesthetics in Google?
How do I evaluate?
Evaluate
sorry,
aesthetics.
Sorry, I'm like having trouble here.
Evaluate aesthetics.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you. I think Google relies a lot on user feedback, and so we have to listen to that carefully and pick the things that make sense. So that's one point of information. But if independent of that, I would say that, again, it's relying on for me personally, like my gut instinct. And I feel like as designers and as we mature and grow, we develop that gut to know what works and what doesn't work. But you have to be really careful not to assume that you always know everything. But if you train yourself, you can say, oh, this is well balanced. It's not doing something over the top. It's not adding a bunch of things for no reason. Like, what's the bare minimum you can get away with and still have a really successful, beautiful looking UI? So it's that process of detraction before it like falls apart and doesn't make sense. But also we have large teams that focus on visual design, and so sometimes you sort of leave them up to them to figure that out, and then they make the contribution, and then they sort of talk about what that is. So being mindful of other people's talent and strengths and playing into that. Mm-hmm.
Hey, how are you? You talked a little bit about the testing process along the just overall from initial requirement to design to, getting something out to users. Can you talk a little bit about when you get a requirement from a stakeholder, are there metrics that must be hit on a project as you go through design? And then as you're designing, can you test to see that your design will actually be hitting those metrics? And at what point in time do you greenlight a particular product or feature to go out based on some of those tests?
Yeah, I think every company is different with how they value or they rate success. I'm not going to get into the specifics of which company does what. Some of that is I can't talk about, but I would say that I don't find myself in a situation where I'm constantly measuring the success of my design or the team's design based on a metric. I think it's awesome to hear after it launches that, hey, you know, it went up by X number, and therefore we're on the right path. And so we try, I think, we try really hard not to let that get in the way of great design. But obviously, if it's not testing well, then you have to rethink things a little bit. But yeah, I think that was one of the two questions you asked, and your second one was?
Yeah, I guess maybe something on top of that would be, when you're getting it in front of users, what are some things that would make you rethink your initial hypothesis of why that might be a good way to go about it?
Yeah, when it literally doesn't make sense to them. They sort of look at it and they're like, I mean, this doesn't really happen that often, but they're like, what am I looking at? You know, like it's just jarring from the beginning. And they don't even have to speak, you can just see it in their face. And so I would say that's a major red flag right there.
So I have a follow-up question regarding testing. When something breaks, you know it, right? It will show up everywhere. But how do you know before that critical error? Like if something is just okay and you want to make improvement, how do you, if you can't get in front of the users you can test, like your users are in different country and something like that, like how do you measure if something was designed just okay or good or great?
So this is, again, relying just on my personal experience, not about how companies do certain things. But I always try, independent of how much it gets tested before it launches, to put myself in the mindset of someone who, one, doesn't speak the language I'm designing in. And I say this because when I moved to the US, I didn't speak English, so I sort of struggled a bit to, you know, understand things in my classroom and understand my peers. So that gave me kind of this extra layer of empathy, I guess, for other people, and really boiling it down to what the core things that I needed to do in order to be understood. And so I treat design the same way. Like, how much can I explain with visuals and not words? And how successful is that design based on that criteria? And so that sort of addresses this issue of like how you get away with not testing across different languages and all of that space. And so, yeah, I think that like, it's hard to say when you feel inside that, oh, this is cool and it's gonna work, because you need validation, even from peers. I never feel comfortable just assuming that my own idea is final and correct until I check in with a group of people at the very least.
All right, guys, I think we're gonna let her take her breath, and everyone please join me in thanking both Angela and Alfonso for tonight's talk.